She was created as a symbol of charity, but treated like a mistake that needed to be hidden. For years, she endured contempt in silence, never once being seen as part of the family. The day they tried to shame her in public, they forgot she was no longer alone. And it was in that instant that everything hidden came to light. Before you hear this powerful story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. Outside the mansion was the portrait of American nobility. White columns, symmetrical gardens, magazines showcasing its image as an example of philanthropy. Inside, it hid the emotional prison of a young woman who grew up believing she needed to be grateful for simply existing. Adopted after her mother's tragic death, she was placed in the house as a symbol of public redemption for a family tainted by scandals. But instead of love, she received silence. They never let her call them parents. She never had a real place. Emily Mitchell walked through the gardens of the Blackwell mansion, her steps almost inaudible on the impeccably manicured lawn. At 27, she carried a natural elegance that contrasted with her always alert gaze, as if she were perpetually on guard. Her wavy brown hair swayed in the morning breeze as she observed the preparations for another family charity event, the 15th she had organized behind the scenes without ever receiving credit. "Emily! Where are the VIP guest lists?" Amber Blackwell's shrill voice cut through the air like a razor blade. "On your desk, as you requested yesterday," Emily replied, with the same calmness she had cultivated over the years as a protective shield. Amber rolled her eyes, her designer dress rustling as she spun on her heels. "I need you to redo it. Ryan Alvarez confirmed his attendance, and I want him at the main table." "The same Ryan who left you standing at the altar 2 years ago?" Emily asked, allowing herself a rare moment of confrontation. Amber's face hardened, her perfectly outlined eyebrows joining in indignation. "Mind your own business, Emily. Remember who pulled you out of the gutter when no one else wanted you." Her words were sharp, designed to wound. "Redo the list and please wear something more appropriate tonight. We don't want anyone confusing you with a guest." Emily watched Amber walk away, the familiar knot in her stomach tightening as it always did when she was reminded of her place in that family. To the world, the Blackwells were examples of generosity for having adopted an orphaned girl 15 years ago. For Emily, that house had never ceased to be a gilded prison. Sighing, she headed to the office to redo the guest list. Her cell phone vibrated in her pocket. "Got a flight for tomorrow? Hang in there, my love, I'll be there soon. M." A genuine smile illuminated her face for the first time that day. Michael, her husband of 8 months, in secret. A marriage that none of the Blackwells knew about or would approve of, not because Michael wasn't suitable, but because he was exactly everything they would never allow for her: independence. Michael Sanders had entered her life like a silent hurricane. A brilliant programmer and successful entrepreneur, they met when Emily was seeking help to develop a digital platform for her secret social project, a system that connected small donors to entrepreneurs from underprivileged communities. While to the world she was just the Blackwells' adopted daughter, to dozens of families in urban peripheries, she was the anonymous founder of the New Start network. Emily. The deep voice of Richard Blackwell, her adoptive father, echoed down the corridor. "I need to speak with you." Quickly putting away her phone, Emily entered the sumptuous office where Richard spent most of his days, managing the family business, or at least pretending there was still business to manage. "Yes, sir?" Richard didn't raise his eyes from the papers on the polished mahogany desk. "Tonight's event needs to be impeccable. Senator Morgan will be present and we need him to approve that project at the ministry." "Everything is under control," replied Emily, keeping a safe distance from the desk as she had learned to do since arriving at that house. "And what about that situation with the bank?" Emily swallowed hard. 3 months ago she had discovered that the Blackwells were on the verge of bankruptcy. A series of disastrous investments had depleted the family fortune. Without their knowledge, she had been using the profits from her own investments to cover the mansion's mortgage payments. Resolved, for now. Richard finally raised his eyes. For an instant, Emily thought she saw gratitude in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar expression of superiority. "Excellent. Now regarding your attire for tonight, Amber has already instructed me," Emily interrupted, trying to hide the bitterness. "I'll wear something appropriate." An uncomfortable silence hung between them. 15 years of living together, and yet they were like strangers inhabiting the same space. "Emily," Richard began, his tone softening slightly, "you know that everything we did was for your own good." She wanted to laugh, she wanted to scream. Instead, she nodded, as she always did. At 12 years old, after losing her mother in an accident, Emily had been adopted by the Blackwells, not out of compassion, but convenience. The family needed to clean up their image after a financial scandal, and nothing was better than adopting an orphan to demonstrate benevolence, especially a pretty, well-educated girl who would make a good impression in photos and news reports. "Of course," she responded mechanically. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check the final details of the decoration." Leaving the office, Emily climbed the stairs toward the tiny room that had been assigned to her at the end of the service corridor, far from the family's main bedrooms. Inside, she locked the door and allowed herself a few moments of weakness, letting silent tears run down her face. On her bed was the uniform she would wear that night, not a gala dress like the guests, but a discreet black and white ensemble. That would clearly identify her as part of the service staff. After 15 years in that house, she was still considered merely a glorified employee. Her cell phone vibrated again. "Got news about the project. We secured full funding." "You did?" "It, love." Emily smiled through tears. The project, her true passion. While the Blackwells believed she spent her days idly around the mansion, Emily had built a small fortune through smart investments and dedicated every free minute to developing the New Start network. What had begun as a modest microfinancing project was now about to become an officially registered foundation with the potential to transform thousands of lives. And soon, she would be free. The plan was in motion. After years of silent humiliations and forced gratitude, Emily had finally gathered the courage and resources to leave. The only reason she was still in that house was to ensure that her departure would be on her own terms. Soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Emily?" It was Rose's voice, the housekeeper, who, unlike the others, had always treated her with genuine affection. "Come in, Rose." The grey-haired lady entered with a concerned expression. "My dear Mrs. Victoria is asking about the flower arrangements and seems furious." Victoria Blackwell, her adoptive mother, was an expert at creating storms in teacups, especially when it came to social events. "I'm coming," replied Emily, discreetly wiping away her tears. "Rose, did you speak with your grandson about that?" "Matter?" The housekeeper's face lit up. "Yes, he can hardly believe the opportunity. Starting his own business has always been his dream." Emily smiled. Peter, Rose's grandson, would be the 100th beneficiary of the New Start network, a talented young man who would now receive funding to open his own auto repair shop. He deserves this chance. And remember, it's our secret. Rose nodded, her eyes moist with gratitude. To the housekeeper, Emily was much more of a daughter than she had ever been to the Blackwells. The afternoon dragged on with preparations. Emily supervised every detail of the event, while Amber and Victoria paraded through the mansion, distributing contradictory orders and complaints. At 6 o'clock, guests began to arrive. Influential politicians, businessmen, celebrities, and socialites, all part of the social circle that the Blackwells desperately tried to maintain, even on the verge of financial ruin. Dressed in her service, uniform Emily circulated discreetly among the guests, ensuring that everything ran perfectly. No one recognized her as part of the family, exactly as Victoria and Richard preferred. "More champagne, sir," she offered to an elderly businessman who was chatting animatedly with Richard. "Ah, yes, thank you," the man replied distractedly, without even looking at her. Beside him, Richard gave her a brief look of approval. Emily was playing her role perfectly. Invisible, efficient, grateful. "Richard, my dear," commented the businessman after a sip of champagne, "your generosity with that orphaned girl was truly admirable. Where is she now? In college?" Emily froze, the tray of drinks trembling slightly in her hands. Richard smiled, that rehearsed smile of a philanthropist. Emily is with us tonight, obviously. We make a point of including her in all family events. Is that so? The man looked around, clearly searching for a young woman dressed as a guest. I'd love to meet her. I always found her story inspiring. Emily felt her heart race. Would this be the moment when Richard would introduce her as a family member? The Blackwell patriarch cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Well, she's quite busy tonight, helping behind the scenes. You know how young people are these days, always wanting to be useful. And so, once again, Emily was reduced to an employee, not a daughter, never a daughter. Excuse me, she murmured, walking away before tears betrayed her. She took refuge in the kitchen, where she placed the tray on the counter and breathed deeply, trying to regain her composure. Don't let them affect you. Emily turned to find Rose watching her with concern. I'm fine, she lied, forcing a smile. No, you're not. Rose approached, gently adjusting the collar of Emily's uniform. But soon you will be. Your husband called my cell phone. He said he'll arrive in the morning. Emily's heart raced, this time with excitement. He's early. Rose smiled conspiratorially. Seems he has a surprise for you. The housekeeper hesitated before continuing. Emily, I know it's none of my business, but are you sure about tomorrow? Emily thought about the plan she had meticulously crafted over the years, about the dossier she had compiled on the Blackwells' failed businesses, about the anonymous transfers she had made to save the mansion from foreclosure, about the revelation she planned to make Minot. More than ever, Rose, it's time for the truth. Before they could continue the conversation, Amber burst into the kitchen. Emily, Dad is looking for you. He wants you to participate in a special performance for the guests. A chill ran down Emily's spine. Performance? Amber's smile was, I see. Something about retelling our family's story, a tribute to the charity we showed by taking you in. Her voice distilled venom disguised as honey. Dress appropriately in 5 minutes in the main hall. When Amber left, Rose held Emily's arm. Child, I don't like this. What are they planning? Emily took a deep breath, a strange calm taking hold of her. Whatever it is, it will be the last humiliation I suffer in this house. Her eyes shone with renewed determination. Tomorrow everything changes. As she headed to the back of the kitchen to change clothes as instructed, Emily didn't imagine that the special performance planned by the Blackwells would be just the beginning of a night that would forever change the fate of everyone in that mansion. A night when masks would fall, truths would be revealed, and the true meaning of family would be redefined. Emily walked toward the main hall with hesitant steps. The simple dress that had been given to her for the performance shamefully contrasted with the luxurious attire of the guests. It was an outdated model, made of raw cotton with faded details, clearly selected to highlight her inferior position in that environment of ostentation. Upon entering the hall, she noticed that the furniture had been rearranged, creating a central space where Richard Blackwell waited with a rehearsed smile. Next to him, a decorative column had been strategically positioned. A gradual silence settled as the guests realized that something special was about to happen. Dear friends, Richard's voice echoed through the hall. Tonight, in addition to raising funds for noble causes, I would like to share with you a small reenactment we've prepared. Her symbolic representation of our family's journey. The curious gazes of the guests turned to Emily, who remained motionless near the entrance of the hall. Victoria approached her and with an artificial smile whispered, Smile, dear. It's the least you can do after everything we've done for you. Emily felt the familiar knot in her throat, that suffocating sensation that had accompanied her since the first day in that house. But today was different. In her pocket, her cell phone vibrated. Discreetly, probably another message from Michael. That small reminder that she was no longer alone gave her the strength to lift her chin and walk to the center of the hall. This young woman, continued Richard, placing his hand on Emily's shoulder with a gesture that to observers seemed affectionate, but which she felt as an oppressive weight, represents all those whom our foundation helps, people who, without our intervention, would be lost in the statistics of social inequality. Amber stepped forward, bringing in her hands something that made Emily's blood freeze, thin but strong ropes. "To illustrate the work of our institution," explained Amber with false sweetness, "we will make an artistic representation. Emily volunteered to be the symbol of those who need help." Volunteered, another lie in the long list of falsehoods that shaped her existence in that family. Emily then realized what was about to happen. She would be literally tied up, displayed as a trophy of the Blackwell's charity. The perfect metaphor for what she had always been in that house. An object, a possession, never really a person. "Please, approach the column," instructed Richard, his smile never wavering as the guests watched, some with genuine interest, others clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle. Emily could have refused. She could have denounced right there the farce that was that family. But years of conditioning and, more importantly, the knowledge that her greater plan depended on enduring this last humiliation, made her obey. "As you can see," narrated Richard, while Amber wrapped Emily's wrists with the ropes, tying them to the column. "Many people find themselves trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Our mission is to free them." The irony was so palpable that Emily almost laughed. As Amber finished the knots, she whispered so low that only Emily could hear, "You always knew it would end like this, didn't you? You were never one. Of us, you never will be." The look Emily returned contained 15 years of pent-up hurt, but also something new, a spark of defiance that made Amber instinctively back away. The performance continued with Richard discoursing on social responsibility and strategic philanthropy. The guests applauded at the appropriate moments, champagne glasses raised in approval. Meanwhile, Emily remained tied to the column, her wrists beginning to hurt from the excessive tightness of the ropes. That's when she noticed movement at the entrance to the hall. Rose, the housekeeper, watched the scene with tears in her eyes and an expression of powerless indignation. Beside her, an unknown man whispered something in her ear. Emily needed a few seconds to process what her eyes were seeing. It was Paul Miller, the lawyer she had secretly hired. He shouldn't have been there that night. His early presence could only mean one thing. The plan had been accelerated. Victoria Blackwell approached Emily holding a champagne glass. "Are you uncomfortable, dear?" she asked, in a tone loud enough for the closest guests to hear. "It's just a symbolic representation. We'll finish soon." "I'm fine, Mrs. Blackwell," replied Emily, emphasizing the formal title she had always been forced to use, even after years living under the same roof. One of the guests, an elderly gentleman whom Emily recognized as an important retired judge, approached with a concerned expression. "Richard, this seems inappropriate," he commented discreetly. "The young woman seems uncomfortable." "Nonsense, Judge Fontaine," laughed Richard, patting the man lightly on the shoulder. "Emily is used to participating in our charitable demonstrations. Isn't that right, dear?" Before Emily could respond, the sound of breaking glass diverted everyone's attention. A glass had slipped from a waiter's tray, shattering on the marble floor. Instinctively, several guests backed away, creating a small commotion. "Someone clean this up immediately," ordered Victoria, visibly irritated by the interruption of her great social moment. It was then that Amber, taking advantage of the confusion, approached Emily again and whispered, "She's used to cleaning up after others." Several people around heard the comment and laughed, some nervously, others with genuine cruelty. Emily felt her face burn with humiliation. A small drop of blood trickled from her wrist, where the rope had cut into the skin due to the instinctive movement she had made when hearing the glass break. The blood dripped onto the marble floor, a vivid red stain against the immaculate white. Emily fixed her gaze on that drop, finding in it a strange symbol of everything she had experienced in that house. Silent pain, unrecognized sacrifice, wounds invisible to the eyes of others. "I think we've demonstrated our point," declared Richard, finally noticing the growing unease among some guests. "Amber, please release our volunteer." But before Amber could approach, a deep and firm voice cut through the hall. "I'll do it." All eyes turned to the entrance of the hall. A tall man with dark skin and elegant attire walked determinedly toward the center of the room. His eyes, fixed on Emily, conveyed a mixture of contained fury and deep love that made her heart race. Michael. It wasn't possible. He was supposed to arrive only in the morning. Yet there he was, advancing through the hall with the confidence of someone who knows exactly his place in the world. Murmurs immediately spread among the guests. Who is he? What's happening? Did someone invite him? Richard and Victoria exchanged worried glances, clearly not understanding the situation. Michael didn't say another word. With firm steps he approached Emily, and with precise movements took a small pocket knife from his pocket. Amber's eyes widened in alarm. "What do you think you're doing?" Richard bellowed, finally recovering from the initial shock. "Security!" But Michael was already beside Emily, skillfully cutting the ropes. Their gazes met briefly, a silent communication passing between them. "Trust me," his eyes said. "Always," hers responded. When the ropes fell, Michael gently took Emily's injured wrists between his hands and, in a gesture that left the room in absolute silence, tenderly kissed the red marks. Then he turned to face the Blackwells. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled but charged, with an authority that made even Richard instinctively back away. "This woman is my wife, and I want to know who thought it acceptable to tie her up like an animal." Shock rippled through the hall like a wave. Victoria visibly paled. Amber let out an exclamation of surprise. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. "Your wife?" he finally managed to articulate. Michael nodded, placing his arm protectively around Emily's waist. "Emily Sanders, my wife of 8 months." He looked at her with a brief smile before returning his hard gaze to the Blackwells. "I thought our joint arrival tomorrow would be less dramatic, but apparently I arrived just in time." Emily felt a strange calm take hold of her. The moment she had planned for so long was happening. Differently, but perhaps even better than she had imagined. Leaning on Michael's strength, she straightened her shoulders and finally found her voice. "I think we owe the guests some explanations," she said, surprising everyone with the firmness of her tone. "After all, this event is about transparency and accountability, isn't it, Richard?" The use of his first name, without the usual "sir" she was forced to employ, caused a visible shudder in the Blackwell patriarch. It was at that moment that Paul Miller, the lawyer, stepped forward with a folder in hand. Beside him, Rose watched, the scene with a mixture of apprehension and satisfaction. "Before we continue," intervened Michael, "I believe it's time to clarify some relevant financial situations. This mansion where we are, for example, there's an interesting story about it that few know." Richard visibly paled, his eyes alternating between Michael, the folder in his hands, and Emily. "I don't know what you're talking about," he declared, with a trembling voice, "and this is not the moment or place to—" "On the contrary," interrupted Emily, her voice gaining strength with each word, "this is exactly the place and the moment. After all, you created this scenario, this performance." She pointed to the column where she had been tied. "It seems appropriate that the truth be revealed here, before all these people who believe they know the Blackwells." The silence in the hall was absolute. The guests, initially shocked, now watched the scene with growing interest, feeling that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Michael opened the folder and extracted some documents. "This house was about to be foreclosed by the bank exactly 3 months ago," he explained, with the calm of someone presenting incontestable facts. "The debts accumulated by the Blackwell family far exceeded their assets." Shocked murmurs rippled through the hall. Victoria brought her hand to her throat, as if suddenly gasping for air. "Lies!" exclaimed Richard, but his face betrayed the truth of Michael's words. "And then," continued Michael, ignoring the interruption, "something curious happened. Substantial payments began to be made to settle these debts, anonymous transfers that saved this mansion from foreclosure." Emily stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the family that had never truly accepted her. "I made those payments," she revealed, simply. "With my college savings, the sale of my car, all the money I managed to gather over years working on independent projects that you never bothered to learn about." Richard's expression was a study in shock and disbelief. "Impossible," he stammered. "You wouldn't have. Where would you get so much money?" "Underestimated people often surprise," Emily replied, "especially those forced to develop independence from an early age." Michael continued the explanation, his voice professional like the successful businessman he was. "Emily not only saved this mansion from bankruptcy, but also legally acquired the property." He passed another document to Richard, who took it with trembling hands. "This property has belonged to my wife since last month." The silent shock gave way to muffled exclamations and murmurs among the guests. Amber, who until then had been observing the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination, advanced furiously. "This is betrayal," she shouted, pointing her finger at Emily. "Is this how you repay everything we did for you? By stealing our home?" Emily maintained her calm even as her heart raced in her chest. "I didn't steal anything, Amber. I saved it. And you tied me up for it." The simplicity of that phrase had a devastating impact. The guests, many of whom had laughed at Emily's humiliation minutes before, now looked at the Blackwells with expressions ranging from disgust to disapproval. The retired judge, who had earlier questioned the good taste of the performance, approached Richard. "I think it's best I take my leave," he said coldly, "and I suggest you reconsider your philanthropic practices." As if that were a signal, other guests began to move toward the exit. The charity event so meticulously planned was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Victoria, partially recovering from the shock, tried to save the situation. "Dear friends, there's been a misunderstanding. Please stay for dinner." Her voice, normally controlled, bordered on desperation. But it was too late. The exposed truth could not be gathered up like shards of a broken glass. The guests were withdrawing in small groups, commenting in horrified whispers about what they had witnessed. Emily observed the scene with a complex mixture of emotions. There was no joy in seeing the social collapse of the Blackwells, only a sense of justice finally being served after so many years. Michael approached and put his arm around her shoulders, his presence strong and comforting. "Shall we go home?" he asked softly. "This is my home now," replied Emily, looking around the hall that for so many years had represented her prison. "But I think we need to give them some time to process all this." The couple walked toward the exit, where Rose waited with tears in her eyes and a proud smile on her lips. As they passed her, Emily stopped briefly and hugged the housekeeper who had been her true family during all those years. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised quietly. "We'll talk about your future here." As they walked out of the mansion, leaving behind the chaos of a dynasty in ruins, Emily felt the weight of 15 years of silence and submission gradually dissolving. Ahead of her, beyond the imposing gates that had for so long made her feel like a prisoner, a new chapter awaited. There was still much to resolve, many wounds to heal, many truths to be told. But that night, when she got into the car beside the man who loved her for who she truly was, Emily finally understood the true meaning of freedom. Dawn found Emily and Michael staying in a suite at the best hotel in the city. After the events of the previous night, they decided to give a day's distance before returning to the mansion, now officially Emily's property. "How are you feeling?" Michael asked, observing Emily as she contemplated the city through the panoramic. A window, a forgotten cup of coffee between her hands. "Free," she replied after a moment of reflection, "and at the same time us lost. It's strange when something you've planned for so long finally happens." Michael approached, embracing her from behind. "Having regrets?" "Not for a second." Emily turned to face him. "That rope on my wrists was the last they will ever place. I just didn't expect everything to happen so publicly." "Some truths need witnesses," Michael commented, gently kissing her forehead. "But now we have decisions to make. What do you want to do with the mansion?" It was a question that Emily had been avoiding since the previous night. The Blackwell mansion, now her mansion, represented so much to her. Emotional prison, status, symbol, years of silent suffering. But it was also home to Rose, the housekeeper who had been more family to her than the Blackwells ever were. I want to transform it, she finally answered, into something useful, something real. Emily's cell. Phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Paul Miller, the lawyer. Emily, the Blackwells are demanding an immediate meeting. Richard is threatening to file lawsuits for fraud. Emily exchanged glances with Michael. Tell them we'll be there in an hour, in the mansion's library. Hanging. Up the phone, Emily took a deep breath. It seems the show continues. Are you sure you're ready for this? Michael asked, concern evident in his gaze. 15 years of preparation, love, she replied with renewed determination. I'm more than ready. When the couple arrived at the mansion, they were greeted by a tense silence. The staff observed them with a mixture of curiosity and respect. The news that Emily was now the owner had spread quickly among the team. Rose awaited them at the entrance, her weary countenance suggesting a sleepless night. They're in the library, she informed, briefly squeezing Emily's hand. Richard spent all night on the phone with lawyers. Thank you, Rose, Emily smiled softly. How are you? Worried about you, child, but proud, very proud. Those simple words strengthened Emily more than any elaborate speech could have. With Michael by her side, she headed to the library, an imposing room that had always been Richard's sanctuary, a space where she was rarely welcome. As they opened the heavy wooden doors, they found the three Blackwells positioned as if for a confrontation. Richard standing behind his desk, Victoria rigidly seated in an armchair, and Amber nervously pacing back and forth. Paul Miller was already present, organizing documents on a side table. Finally decided to show up at your new property? The sarcasm in Richard's voice barely disguised his contained fury. Good morning to you too, Emily replied with a calmness that surprised even herself. I believe we have matters to discuss. Matters to discuss? Amber practically shouted. You betrayed us, publicly humiliated our family. I think it was the other way around, intervened Michael, his tone polite but firm. Or have you already forgotten that Emily was tied up like an exhibition animal last night? Victoria, visibly, paled at the reminder, while Richard pounded his fist on the desk. That was an artistic representation, part of the event. A representation she didn't consent to, Paul Miller observed calmly, looking up from his documents. We have at least 12 witnesses willing to confirm this, including a retired judge. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Emily took advantage of the moment to calmly sit in one of the armchairs, Michael positioning himself protectively behind her. I didn't come here to discuss the past. Emily finally broke the silence. I came to talk about the future. Future? Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice trembling. What future can we have after you stole our home? Emily held the gaze of the woman who had never allowed her to call her mother. I saved this. Home, Victoria. The documents Paul has prove it. This house would belong to the bank if I hadn't intervened. With what money? Richard questioned, his distrust evident. How did a girl who barely left this house get the resources to buy a property of this value? Michael smiled discreetly. Your girl is a successful businesswoman, Mr. Blackwell. The New Start Network employs more than 50 people and has helped hundreds of entrepreneurs in underprivileged communities. The expression of shock on the Blackwells' faces would be comical in other circumstances. The New Start Network is yours? Amber seemed genuinely perplexed, but that project won the Social Innovation Award last year. Yes, Emily confirmed simply. While you believed I was busy being grateful for existing, I was building my own life. Paul Miller stepped forward, placing a folder on Richard's desk. These are the terms Emily is proposing for the transition of ownership. I believe you'll find them more than generous considering the circumstances. Richard opened the folder with trembling fingers, his eyes quickly scanning the documents. As he read, his expression changed from anger to disbelief, and finally, to something close to respect. You're offering us to remain in the house? He asked incredulously. Emily nodded. In the East Wing with all amenities and a monthly allowance, as long as you accept some conditions. What conditions? Victoria asked, approaching to read the documents over Richard's. Shoulder. The mansion will be partially converted into a support center for vulnerable youth, Emily explained, her voice gaining enthusiasm. The ground floor and the gardens will be shared spaces for educational and cultural programs. You will maintain your privacy in the East Wing, but the house will finally fulfill a real purpose beyond being a setting for empty social events. Amber let out a bitter laugh. And if we refuse? Michael stepped forward. The documents are clear, Miss Blackwell. The property legally belongs to Emily. Your options are to accept these generous terms or to seek accommodation elsewhere. With your current financial difficulties, I believe the choice is simple. A tense silence took over the library as the Blackwells processed the reality of their situation. Years of financial mismanagement, failed investments, and an unsustainable lifestyle had finally caught up with them, and the young woman they had always treated as inferior now held their future in her hands. Why? Victoria's question surprised everyone, especially for the tone devoid of hostility, just a genuine perplexity. Why offer us anything after how we treated you? Emily felt a knot in her throat, years of repressed emotions threatening to overflow. She took a deep breath before answering, "Because I don't want to be like you. I don't want to use power to humiliate or control. This house has enough space for everyone, as long as there is mutual respect. And because, despite everything, it's been 15 years sharing the same roof. That means something, even if it's not what I dreamed of when I arrived here as a frightened girl." The silence that followed had a different weight. Richard, usually so controlled and cold, suddenly seemed aged, the wrinkles on his face more pronounced under the morning light entering through the library windows. "We need time to discuss," he finally said, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. "You have until tomorrow," replied Paul Miller professionally. "The documents are ready for signature." As they left the library, Emily felt Michael gently squeeze her hand in support. In the corridor, Rose anxiously waited. "And?" asked the housekeeper. "I gave them a choice," Emily replied. "Now it's up to them." "And what about you? What will you do now?" Emily smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her eyes in a way Rose hadn't seen in years. "Now? I'm going to get to know my house. Really know it, for the first time." In the hours that followed, Emily walked through the spaces of the mansion that for so many years had been her home and her prison. Each room held memories, some painful, others precious. The tiny room she had occupied for years, the garden where she found refuge on quiet afternoons, the kitchen where Rose had taught her to make cookies in secret when the Blackwells traveled. Michael accompanied her, in respectful silence, understanding that this was a moment of personal reconciliation for his wife. Late in the afternoon, sitting in the garden gazebo with Rose, the three shared tea while planning the transformations they would make to the property. "The basement can be converted into classrooms," suggested Michael. "It has good natural lighting on that side. And the music room that nobody uses would be perfect for art workshops," added Emily enthusiastically. Rose observed the young woman she had watched grow, now finally free to dream aloud. "You know, what makes me happiest," commented the housekeeper, "seeing you finally occupying your space without asking permission." A shadow briefly crossed Emily's face. "Do you think I'm being too hard on them? Offering only the East Wing?" Rose shook her head. "The East Wing has 6 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a private living room. Believe me, it's more than enough." The sound of footsteps interrupted the conversation. Amber was approaching the gazebo, her posture still arrogant, but something in her eyes seemed different. "Can I talk to you?" "Alone?" she asked, addressing Emily. Michael and Rose exchanged concerned glances, but Emily calmly nodded. "I'll go inside to prepare more tea," offered Rose, standing up. "And I'll check the basement plans with Paul," Michael added, not without first whispering to Emily, "I'll be nearby." When they were alone, an uncomfortable silence established itself between the two women who had grown up as sisters only on paper. "Why did you never tell?" Amber finally asked, sitting on the bench opposite to Emily. "About your business. Your marriage, all this." Emily considered the question for a moment. "You never asked, Amber. You never showed interest in my life beyond the tasks you assigned me in this house." Amber lowered her eyes, an unusual gesture for someone generally. So confrontational. "Mom and Dad will accept your proposal," she finally revealed. "It's not like we have a choice." "There's always a choice," replied Emily softly, "even when the options aren't the ones we prefer." A thoughtful silence followed, interrupted only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the garden. "What's it like?" Amber asked abruptly. "Being free? Having someone who really sees you?" The question caught Emily by surprise. Behind the usual arrogance, she glimpsed something she never imagined seeing in Amber: vulnerability. "It's like breathing after years underwater," she answered honestly. "It's frightening and wonderful at the same time." Amber nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something beyond her reach. She stood up abruptly. "Well, tell your lawyer we'll be ready to sign tomorrow." As she watched Amber walk away, Emily felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was no forgiveness yet. Some wounds were too deep to heal quickly, but there was perhaps the beginning of something new, a mutual recognition of humanity that had never existed before. That night, when Emily and Michael sat on the veranda, with Rose to dine under the stars, there was a sense of beginning in the air. The mansion around them, for so long a symbol of oppression disguised as privilege, seemed to breathe differently. "To our new life," toasted Michael, raising his glass. Emily smiled, observing the soft lights of the house reflected in her glass. "To rebuilding," she gently corrected. "Of spaces, of stories, and of people." Rose also raised her glass, eyes moist with contained emotion. "To the family we choose." Across the table, their hands met. Three people united not by blood or adoption, papers, but by something much stronger: choice, respect, and true love. And in the mansion that would now serve a greater purpose than social status, a new story was beginning to be written. 3 months passed since the night that changed everything at the Blackwell mansion, or rather, at the mansion now simply called New Haven. The transformation wasn't just in the name, but in every aspect of the imposing house. The ground floor, previously dedicated to rarely used salons and social exhibition environments, now buzzed with life. 3 rooms had been converted into multi-purpose spaces for classes and workshops. The former ballroom had become an informal auditorium where young people learned music, theatre, and dance. The gardens, once impeccably pruned more to be seen than lived in, now housed small community gardens and gathering areas. Emily walked through the corridors, checking the final preparations for the official inauguration of the New Start Development Center, which would take place that night. She observed with satisfaction a group of teenagers helping to arrange chairs in the auditorium while animatedly discussing the presentation they would make. "Nervous?" Michael's voice appeared beside her as he handed her a cup of coffee. "A little," admitted Emily, gratefully accepting the drink. "It's strange to think that in a few hours this place will be full of authorities, press, and people whose lives you've transformed," completed Michael, gently kissing her forehead. "Don't forget that." Emily smiled, briefly leaning on her husband's shoulder before continuing her rounds. There was so much to check before the ceremony. As she passed through the corridor leading to the east wing, she instinctively slowed her pace. That part of the house, now separated from the rest by an elegant double wooden door, was Blackwell territory. The adaptation hadn't been easy. In the first weeks, Richard and Victoria barely left their quarters, communicating only through Rose. Amber alternated between periods of open hostility and reluctant curiosity about the changes to the property. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, small transformations began to occur. The first sign came when Victoria, after silently observing a gardening workshop from the veranda for days, offered some rare seedlings from her ornamental plants for the project. Then it was Richard who surprisingly appeared in the library, now a community space, to donate part of his book collection to the growing collection being assembled. Amber remained the most resistant, but even she eventually began to interact with the new environment, especially after meeting Lucia, a young fashion designer who had come to give a workshop at the center and whose vibrant personality seemed to awaken something in Emily's formerly bitter sister. "Emily," Rose's voice interrupted her thoughts. The housekeeper, now officially the administrative manager of the center, approached hurriedly. We need to talk, in private. Something in the older woman's expression immediately put Emily on alert. Did something happen? Rose looked around, making sure they were alone. I received a call from someone named Charles Olson. He says he has important information about your biological mother and insists on speaking with you before today's event. Emily felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. In 15 years living with the Blackwells, the subject of her biological family had always been taboo. She knew only what the official documents said, that her mother, Elizabeth Mitchell, had died in an accident when Emily was 12, with no other known relatives. Charles Olson, she repeated, trying to recall if she had ever heard that name before. Did he say what he wants? Not exactly. But he asked you to meet him this afternoon before the ceremony. He said it's about the truth that the Blackwells are hiding. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Did you tell anyone about this call? Only you, Rose assured. I thought you should decide what to do without interference. Emily nodded, grateful for the discretion of the woman who had been more of a mother to her than Victoria would ever be. I'll meet him. But I need you to let Michael know in case I don't return in time for the final preparations. Are you sure you should go alone? Rose asked, concern evident in her wrinkled face. Some journeys need to be made alone, replied Emily, briefly hugging the housekeeper, but I promise to be careful. An hour later, Emily parked her car in front of a discreet cafe in the city centre. Dressed simply in jeans and a white blouse, she seemed far from the image of the successful businesswoman or the hostess of the night's big event. She was just Emily, the girl who never really knew her origins. The cafe was almost empty at that time of the afternoon. A middle-aged man stood up as soon as she entered. He wore a simple suit, closely cropped graying hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many stories. Emily? He asked, approaching cautiously. Mr. Olson? He nodded, indicating a table at the back. They sat down, the silence between them laden with unspoken expectations. Thank you for coming, he finally began. I've been following your trajectory for some time, since the first articles about the New Start network began appearing in the press. Emily studied the man carefully, trying to decipher his face, looking for any resemblance that might indicate a connection between them. Who are you? She asked directly. And what do you know about my mother? Charles took a deep breath, like someone preparing to dive into turbulent waters. I'm a former private investigator. I was hired by Richard Blackwell 15 years ago to... He hesitated. To monitor your mother. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. What? Why would the Blackwells be monitoring my mother? Because Elizabeth Mitchell worked for them as Richard's personal assistant, and because she discovered something that could destroy the family's reputation and businesses. Emily felt her blood freeze in her veins. The accident, she murmured. Charles lowered his eyes. There was never any accident, Emily. The cafe around her seemed to have completely silenced. Emily felt only the accelerated pulsing of her heart as the implications of those words penetrated her consciousness. What are you saying? She asked in a thread of a voice. Your mother didn't die in an accident. She was... He searched for the most adequate word. Silenced. And you were adopted by the Blackwells, not out of charity, but to ensure that no one would ever investigate Elizabeth's disappearance too deeply. Emily's hands trembled as she tried to process this devastating information. Why are you telling me this now? Why did you wait 15 years? Charles took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. Because I saw what happened at the charity gala. I saw how they treated you. And because your mother deserves justice. She was a good person, Emily. Intelligent, honest, courageous. His voice faltered slightly. Too courageous for her own good. You knew her well, observed Emily, noticing the man's barely disguised emotion. We were close, admitted Charles. That's why, when Richard hired me to follow her, I began to suspect. And when she disappeared, I knew something was wrong, but I had no proof until now. He pushed the envelope across the table. Emily stared at it as if it were an alien object. What is this? Documents that your mother hid. About her money. laundering scheme that the Blackwells operated through their supposed charity works. She discovered everything, made copies, and hid them where no one would think to look. And where was that? A slight sad smile appeared on Charles's face. In your toy box, in a special teddy bear she had given you. The bear was lost during your move to the Blackwell mansion, but in reality it was confiscated and kept in Richard's private safe. It took me years to gain access to it. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. Mr. Pudgy, she murmured, the memory emerging from the depths of her mind. A brown bear with a white patch on his belly. She said he kept our secrets. Charles nodded, clearly moved by that memory. You remember? I remember fragments, admitted Emily. I have dreams, sometimes, of a woman singing to me with the scent of jasmine. She adored jasmine, confirmed Charles softly. She planted them in every place we lived. Emily looked up, the sudden realization leaving her breathless. You are. Charles swallowed hard before completing. I'm not your biological father, if that's what you're thinking, but I loved your mother deeply, and I promised myself that one day, when it was safe, you would know the truth. Emily opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside she found photographs, documents, receipts, handwritten notes, meticulously organized evidence of a criminal scheme that had enriched the Blackwells for years. Why now? She finally asked. Why is it safe now and not before? Because now you have power, replied Charles simply. You have resources, visibility, people who support you, and because the Blackwells are more vulnerable than they've ever been. Emily flipped through the documents, each page revealing a new layer of the lie that had been her life. A feeling of growing anger began to replace the initial shock. What do you suggest I do with this? That's your decision, replied Charles carefully. You could hand everything over to the authorities. Richard would certainly face prison, or you could confront them privately, or simply move forward knowing the truth but choosing your own path. Emily put the documents back in the envelope, her mind working quickly. And you? What do you gain from this? Charles smiled sadly. Peace, perhaps. I've carried this secret for a long time, Emily, and a promise I made to your mother the last time I saw her. What promise? That one day, when it was safe, I would tell you not just about the Blackwell's crime, but also about who she really was, how much she loved you, how she fought to protect you until the end. Emily felt tears now flowing freely down her face. What was she like? She asked in a whisper. Charles took a small photograph from his shirt pocket, a young woman with brown hair and eyes intensely similar to Emily's, holding a small girl in her arms, both smiling at the camera. She was like you, he replied, simply. Strong, determined, compassionate, able to see beyond appearances, and totally dedicated to making this world a better place, starting with those she loved. Emily touched the photograph with reverence, as if through it she could feel the presence of the mother she barely remembered having. I have an important event tonight, she finally said, keeping the photograph along with the documents. I know. The center's inauguration. It's an admirable initiative. I'd like you to be there, invited Emily, surprising even herself. I think my mother would approve of what I'm trying to do. Charles seemed genuinely touched by the invitation. Are you sure? Absolutely. And after... She took a deep breath, a new determination in her gaze. After I'll talk with the Blackwells, all of them. It's time for the complete truth to come out. When they left the cafe, the afternoon sun cast elongated shadows along the city streets. Emily felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders only to be replaced by an even greater responsibility. Thank you, she said as they parted, for taking the risk to tell me all this. Charles nodded respectfully. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Emily, especially because you did it without any help from those who should have taken care of you. As she drove back to the mansion, Emily felt a strange calm. The revelations of that afternoon should have devastated her, but instead she felt strangely strengthened, as if she finally understood not just where she came from, but also why she had always felt like a stranger in that house. There was an important ceremony to conduct that night, a center that would change the lives of hundreds of young people. would be officially inaugurated, and afterward there would be a decisive conversation with the Blackwells. But now, for the first time in her life, Emily knew exactly who she was and what she needed to do. The mansion that had for so long been her prison would now be the stage for her true liberation, and perhaps ironically, it would also be the place where she would finally find peace with her past, a past much more complex and painful than she had ever imagined. The night of the inauguration transformed the mansion into a spectacle of lights and possibilities. What was once a monument to exclusive opulence had become a vibrant space of inclusion and hope. More than 200 people circulated through the renovated environments: authorities, sponsors, families of the young people served, and press representatives. Emily, in an elegant dark blue dress, conducted the ceremony with a serenity that contrasted with the inner storm that the afternoon's revelations had provoked. By her side, Michael perfectly played his role of silent support, perceiving that something had changed in his wife, but respecting her space. "This center represents more than a social or educational project," declared Emily in the opening speech, her voice clear and firm echoing through the packed auditorium. "It represents our belief that every person deserves a second chance, that no past determines our future, that we can, all of us, give new meaning to our stories." As she spoke, her gaze scanned the audience, noting Charles discreetly positioned near the entrance. More surprising, however, was noticing that the three Blackwells were present, something she hadn't expected. Richard maintained himself rigidly upright in his seat, his face impenetrable, while Victoria seemed strangely fragile beside him. Amber, seated at some distance from her parents, observed everything with poorly disguised curiosity. After the formal speeches, while the guests circulated admiring the facilities, Emily was approached by numerous people: politicians wanting to associate themselves with the successful project, businessmen interested in sponsorships, journalists eager for stories of overcoming. "Are you okay?" Michael asked during a rare moment of privacy between presentations. "You seem distant." Emily intertwined her fingers with his, seeking strength. Turn his familiar touch. "We need to talk afterward. I discovered something about my mother, about the Blackwells." Michael studied her face carefully. "Something serious?" "Transformative," she replied simply. "But now I need to finish this here, and then I need to talk to them." The night advanced, and gradually the guests began to disperse. When only a small group remained, Emily approached Rose. "Could you ask the Blackwells to meet me in the library in half an hour? It's important." Rose nodded, knowing Emily well enough to perceive the determination in her gaze. "And what about the last guests?" "Michael will take care of them. Please also make sure we won't be interrupted." Exactly 30 minutes later, Emily entered the library, the room that had always been the center of Blackwell power and that had now served as the stage for her first confrontation months ago. The three were already waiting for her: Richard impatiently standing near the window, Victoria rigidly seated in an armchair, Amber restlessly thumbing through a book she clearly wasn't really reading. Michael accompanied Emily, as did Charles, who was received with confused looks by the Blackwells. "What is this meeting, Emily, and who is this man?" questioned Richard, his authoritative tone an attempt to regain a control he no longer possessed. Emily placed on the library table the envelope that Charles had given her earlier. With deliberately slow movements, she spread its contents: documents, photographs, notes. "This man's name is Charles Olson," she introduced calmly. "And he knew my mother very well, the woman you hired, spied on, and eventually silenced to protect your secrets." Richard's face instantly paled. Victoria brought her hand to her mouth in a gesture of shock, while Amber looked confused from her parents to Emily. "What absurdity is this?" Richard tried to protest, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. "Don't insult my intelligence, Richard," replied Emily coldly. "I have here all the evidence of the money laundering scheme you operated through your supposed charitable works, the same documents that my mother discovered and that cost her her life." A heavy silence took over the library. Michael observed the scene with a mixture of shock and admiration for his wife's strength. Charles maintained himself silently standing, near the door like a silent witness to a long-delayed moment. It was an accident, Victoria finally spoke, her voice trembling. We never wanted her to die. Victoria! Richard severely warned, but it was too late. Emily felt her heart accelerate with the involuntary confession. So you admit it? After 15 years, you simply admit it? Victoria covered her face with her hands, unable to face Emily. What's happening? Amber demanded, her voice betraying panic. Dad? Mom? What is she talking about? Richard seemed to have aged a decade in minutes. His shoulders fell, the once arrogant face now showing the marks of a man cornered by his own mistakes. It was another time, he finally murmured. The business was on the verge of bankruptcy. We needed that money. And my mother found out, completed Emily. She threatened to denounce us, continued Richard, his gaze lost in memories. We tried to negotiate, offer money, but she was inflexible. Honest, corrected Charles, speaking for the first time. The word you're looking for is honest. Richard gave him a look of bitter recognition. The investigator. I should have guessed you would keep digging. What did you do to her? Asked Emily, her voice dangerously controlled. Victoria sobbed quietly before answering. It was just to scare her. Richard hired men to force her to hand over the documents, but something went wrong. Something went wrong? Emily repeated incredulously. My mother was killed and you adopted me to cover up the crime, and you call that something went wrong? Amber rose abruptly, her face contorted in horror. You told me she was an orphan, that we were helping a poor girl without a family. And you treated me like a servant, not a daughter, retorted Emily bitterly, because deep down, you always knew I was the daughter of the woman you destroyed. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Michael approached, gently placing his hand on Emily's shoulder in a gesture of silent support. What do you intend to do with this information? Richard finally asked, his tone defeated. Emily studied at length the man she had feared and hated in equal measure for years, the man responsible for her mother's death and for the theft of her childhood. That's the question I've been asking myself since I discovered the truth, she replied slowly. I could hand everything over to the police right now. You would be arrested, probably spend the rest of your lives in jail. Victoria sobbed louder, and even Richard seemed resigned to the inevitable. But I realized something today, continued Emily. Revenge won't bring my mother back. It won't erase the 15 years I lived under your roof, and it won't help any of the young people who now depend on this center. She gathered the documents, carefully organizing them back into the envelope. So here's what's going to happen. You will sign the total transfer of the property to the New Start Foundation, including the East Wing. You will move to the apartment you maintain in the city and never return here. You will transfer half of your remaining assets to a fund that will create scholarships in the name of Elizabeth Mitchell. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Emily raised her hand, silencing him. In exchange, I won't hand these proofs over to the police. You can live the rest of your lives in freedom, although I doubt you'll find peace. And if we refuse? Challenged Richard, in a last flash of the powerful man he once was. Charles stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the man who had indirectly destroyed his happiness 15 years ago. I have copies of all this, and contacts in the press who would love the story of how the respectable Blackwell family built their fortune on crime and death. Michael intervened with a calm but firm voice. The documents for a transfer are prepared. Paul Miller brought them today. They're in the next room. Emily observed the three Blackwells, the family that was never really hers, and felt a strange compassion mixed with her resentment. They were broken people in their own way, prisoners of their choices and lies. Why? Amber suddenly asked. Why not destroy us completely? After everything we did, what I did. Emily held her gaze for a long moment. Because I choose to be defined by what I build, not by what I destroy, she replied simply. And because someone needs to break the cycle. An hour later, the documents were signed. The Blackwells would leave the mansion in the morning, ending a dark chapter in the history of that place. When everyone had withdrawn, Emily remained in the library with Charles and Michael, the silence between them laden with unverbalized emotions. "Your mother would be proud," Charles finally said, his voice choked. "She always believed in second chances." "Seems I inherited that from her." Emily smiled softly. "I'd like to know more about her. Everything you can tell me." "It would be an honor," replied Charles, then taking his leave, promising to return in a few days. When they were alone, Michael wrapped Emily in his arms. "Are you sure you made the right decision?" he asked gently. "No," admitted Emily, "but I made the decision that will allow me to move forward, the one that honors what my mother tried to do, not what was done to her." Michael gently kissed her forehead. "You know what this means? That finally we're really free. All of us." The next morning, Emily watched from the garden as the Blackwells departed in silence. There were no emotional farewells or false promises of reconciliation, just a necessary closure of a painful chapter. Rose approached, offering a cup of tea. "Have you decided what to do with their room?" she asked pragmatically. Emily smiled, grateful for the housekeeper's constant and practical presence. "I was thinking of transforming it into dormitories for teenagers who need temporary shelter. What do you think?" "I think it's perfect," Rose nodded with satisfaction. "Transforming empty spaces into places of welcome. It's what you always do best." Later that day, Emily found herself alone in Victoria and Richard's former room, a sumptuous space that had always been forbidden to her as a child. Seated at the wide window overlooking the gardens, she observed the late afternoon light gilding the trees and illuminating the newly planted beds. Michael found her like this, contemplative and serene. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked softly, approaching. Emily smiled, extending her hand to him. "I'm discovering that I'm more than okay," she replied. "I'm reborn." Michael sat beside her, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Rose told me you're planning a jasmine garden on the west side." Emily nodded, a genuine smile illuminating her face. "My mother loved them, and I want there to be something of her here. Not just the pain of what happened, but the beauty of who she was." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the mansion's gardens, no longer a fortress of isolated privilege, but a beacon of possibilities and renewal. "Did you know I found that little diary of mine from when I first arrived here?" commented Emily. "Back then I wrote that I dreamed of escaping this place, that I imagined a day when I would be free of this house and this family. And now? Now I understand that freedom isn't in escaping, but in transforming, in creating spaces, physical and emotional, where others can grow." Michael delicately kissed her hand. "Like you transformed this house, like you transformed me." Emily rested her head on his shoulder, watching the setting sun tint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I think that's what it really means to own your own story," she reflected. "It's not about controlling every aspect of it or erasing the painful parts. It's about honoring the past while building a different future." That night, the mansion that had once been the stage for so much silent suffering sheltered renewed dreams and infinite possibilities. In the library that now served curious minds, in the garden that nourished both body and soul, in the corridors that once echoed authoritarian orders and now resonated with laughter and animated plans. And at the center of it all was Emily, no longer the silenced orphan, no longer the rebellious heiress, but a woman who had finally found her own power in the ability to transform pain into purpose. The Blackwells' story had ended. The story of New Haven was just beginning. And somewhere, perhaps in the jasmine that would soon bloom in the West Garden, the spirit of Elizabeth Mitchell smiled, finally at peace, seeing her daughter complete the cycle of redemption she had initiated so many years before. As Emily closed her diary that night, a sense of completeness enveloped her. Her journey from forced silence to powerful voice, from emotional imprisonment to transformative freedom, had finally reached a point of balance. Looking at the small camera on her desk, Emily smiled softly. "I shared my story with you because I Believe in the power of narratives to inspire change. As Emily discovered, sometimes we need to revisit our past to rewrite our future. And you? What personal transformation story do you carry? She stood up, walking to the window where the moonlight illuminated the gardens of New Haven. If this journey touched your heart, I invite you to join our community of storytellers and listeners. Subscribe to the channel by clicking the button on your right to follow other stories of rebirth and overcoming that we publish every week. Emily picked up a small pot with a jasmine sprout, placing it delicately on the windowsill. Just like this jasmine that will grow with proper care, our community flourishes with each new subscriber, each shared comment, and each exchanged experience. Leave your like if Emily's story resonated with you, and tell us in the comments, what space in your life needs transformation? With a final look at the camera, Emily smiled with genuine hope. Remember, true ownership isn't in control, but in the capacity to transform. See you in the next story, with more narratives that, like this one, illuminate the dark corners of human experience and celebrate our power to begin anew. Until next time. The small jasmine on the windowsill swayed gently with the night breeze, its green leaves promising future flowers, just as each shared story promises new connections, reflections, and possibilities.